Just real quick, check his team's good. Okay. And then I speak with my hands, and I'll probably walk around and ask a bunch of questions. It's kind of my style, and I'll probably need help keeping track of time because I love taking the stories all over the place. But yeah, like Brian said, there's only I think there's only 3 MVPs, right, in West Michigan. Is that we know of, like, so we need more. So I invite you to all speak to us after. So there's Jay, Brian, myself. I'm an AI MVP in which category? Azure .NET. Oh boy, and the mouse clicker isn't gonna. Here we go. All right, so before I go into some of the stuff that I want to talk about, I want to start. This is unique. I usually speak to people who've never heard of Azure before. The only time I had people that raised their hand and said they've used Azure was at a security conference last year. I did the keynote at Lake Michigan Credit Ballpark, LMCU Ballpark, and I asked some people, I was like, have you used ChatGPT? And a few would raise their hands, and then Azure, and 2 had raised their hands. And 1 had actually tried to make his custom neural voice, right? He had actually made his voice, and I was like, wow. So here, I mean, I think there's a mix of people. So has everybody been into Azure, I guess? Anybody not been logged into Azure? All right, interesting, yeah. And then of those that use Azure, how many of you spin up your own OpenAI GPT-4 instance? All right, the MVPs, and then, yeah, and tell me about your experience and background.
Yeah, it was actually last year for an internship project at my previous employer. We ended up building a system that was kind of like a personal assistant slash subject matter expert that we used OpenAI 3.5 4 when it was finally released, and then kind of built our own little RAG architecture.
RAG, nice.
Yep.
Sweet. And when was this?
Actually, this was last summer.
Wow.
So between June and May and August, yeah.
Wow. Anybody else use RAG? Tried RAG, the MVPs? Mark back there. Interesting. So we'll talk a little more about that, but we'll keep track. May come back to you. But I always start with this too. Is I went to the U.S. Census Bureau. They finally released. It's the business survey, business outlook survey, right? And this year, about a month ago, they released the AI supplement. I think for the first time. Right? So that says something when the U.S. Census Bureau is starting to track it. And you've heard about all the investment and money going in. But, this was an interesting, why does this business not plan to use AI? They're asking why, and not applicable to this business, right? 80%. I was dumbfounded. I was asking, I have ChatGPT on, I use it on my phone, the talk version, right? And I was driving here today. It's like, explain this to me, right? And a lot of it is fear. A lot of it is, there's misunderstanding. There's, what is this? How would it apply? Nobody else in my industry uses it. But I'm curious. I want to hear from you. Maybe looking back, are there any fears that you have of AI? I'm going to talk about, I have a lot of fears. The reason I'm in this business is because I was afraid. I was a project manager, director of project management at a company in Holland. And I was like, project management a lot of times is just tasks, get it on schedule. And I was like, with AI, what am I doing? Like, this can be automated, right? And then I was a manager of project managers. So I was automating people that were automating, doing tasks, tracking tasks. And I was like, this is not the right way to go. I want to understand this thing that's going to take my job. And then I discovered wonderful things with it. It can apply anywhere. And I'll talk a little bit about that, my neural voice projects. But that's why I got started. It was actually a fear. I was like, if this thing is going to take my job, I want to know what this thing is. So I want to hear, maybe some brave souls, what you think about and any fears that you have come up with. Go ahead.
I'm a professor at Stanford University and part of our AI task force. So it's how do we continue having beneficial have access to AI. The issue of cheating is a big issue. How do we restructure all of the curriculum to utilize it? Because we don't want to ban it like many places do.
Yeah.
So that's right now we're scrambling. How do we do this? And the problem is there's a very small number of college and technology professors. The rest of the teachers who have the issue, no clue. They can barely log into their computers, and we're asking them to rewrite their material in order to handle AI.
Yeah, big question, education. I've worked with schools in the Holland area, West Ottawa. I sat with tables of teachers, and I started talking about AI, and I had people actually physically stand up and leave my table. Yeah, that's the reaction I got, right? So from academia, from high schools, there is a lot of fear, and a lot of the fear too. I think some of it is around job loss, right? And teachers, I would feel threatened too, I think, if I was in those shoes. So interesting one there. Anybody else? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's the bias that the trained data can have
Hmm.
inaccuracy. It's going to answer confidently, but it may not be right.
Yeah. RAG is an interesting one, and maybe we'll touch on RAG too, how it fits in and why Microsoft kind of started working with RAG to ground it in truth, because, the hallucinations, once you figured out the edges, right, you knew what buttons to push to get this thing to just, the jailbreak stuff, right? And also, speaking of biasing, I'm going to talk a little bit about, so I work with, I'm half Thai, and I speak Thai fluently. And I was working with a gentleman in Thailand who was a Microsoft director. And he said, we're working on a project in Thailand, and we try to improve healthcare and get access to the Burmese immigrants. There's a lot of Burmese people that come into Bangkok. And he said, we try to use GPT-4. It was supposed to speak the most number of languages, and we tried Burmese, and it failed miserably. It didn't know. They're kind of in a war right now. So he's like, can you go ask for content to fine tune a model to speak Burmese? No, because they're fighting over there. So how are you going to fix this issue, right? And so you see part of the world just racing ahead, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But there are certain languages that aren't in the model, and that's a fear for me. Is the main language, right? Of course, is English and Python. Now, some people talk about that, how the computer language that it's trained on is Python. So what happens to the less known languages that it doesn't understand? What happens to the human languages that it doesn't understand? So that biasing is yeah, a very, very interesting question. Anybody else? Maybe
Yeah, so I'm probably one of the least technical people here, but I think one of the fears that I had is obviously some of the people Todd mentioned before, the biases, the taking of jobs. I think some of it too is sometimes people just relying so much on AI and technology itself, not knowing the inaccuracies that can come up with it too, and being able to think that, well, it's just going to solve all the problems. In reality, there's still a lot that the human element has to be involved in, because the information that it's getting is only as good as what's being put in. It may not be as accurate.
yeah. And I've spent 3 years with it now. And I find, and I truly believe it has to be augmented by humans. I don't think humanity will ever let it just kind of take over. But that's my opinion, and maybe the other MVPs and can chime in. But and the other thing I worried about is I've seen it accelerate my life, my boys. I gave it to all my 3 boys, my wife, everybody I touch with it to augment their life accelerates ahead, right? And my concern really now is there's still large chunks of the population that don't have access, and they don't know how to speak to it, the prompt engineering, how to get the knowledge and accelerate their lives. So my concern is for those groups. And I don't know if you other MVPs want to.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. My wife is completely anti-technology anything. It's really not. Her understanding of AI is it helps kids cheat in school. That's how she would
Yeah.
summarize it to me right now. As much as I have tried to explain to her, she's still, well, number one, she doesn't listen to me on many things. We could spend another hour on that. But she has just heard the news stories of, and then heard our kids talking about how people in school get in trouble because they're using it to cheat.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm understanding AI. It's totally true.
Yeah. And Jay, any thoughts on?
Yeah. Early on, when ChatGPT first came out at the end of 2 years ago, my daughter used it to study for an AP test, and this was right after it famously was starting to pass AP tests. 3.5, I think, was out the version at that time. But she used it to study for the AP US history test, which is notoriously one of the more difficult ones.
Yeah.
And it would quiz her, and then it would say, you're kind of weak in this area. She'd say, what should I study? And it would give her a list of things to study.
Yeah.
Definitely gives you a leg up if you know how and when to use it.
Yeah, interesting. That's I gave it to my 3 boys, and I'll go into a quick story. Is my middle child. I find the younger one. I have a 13-year-old who doesn't seem to grasp the metacognition and how you can use it to think outside of his world. But it seems my my high schooler, sorry, seems to be able to do that. And he was using it one day, and his teacher, social studies, gave him a rubric. He entered the rubric. He knew to write the paper on his own. He's already thinking through about how teachers are going to check him. He wrote the paper on his own, put in the teacher's rubric, had the ChatGPT grade his paper, and then it gave him a score. It's like 3 out of 5. He called me over at this point. I was on the couch, zoomed out. I was like, I'm not going over there. And he's like, ChatGPT, Dad. I'm like, okay. It's like, what have you done? And he's like, well, I put it in. It gave me a 3 out of 5. She curves it to 4 out of 5. I've done the calculations. That still has an A in my class. And at this point, I'm calling my wife, right? She's running out of the kitchen. She looks at it, and it's got, if you want a 5 out of 5, do this, 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 and this. And she goes, well, did you do all these things to get out of 5 out of 5? And he said, no, because I have math class, I have math homework, and I have volleyball practice tonight. So he was starting to use it to manage his time, get instant feedback. And the thing I thought of at that point was, what about the parents of the children who are high achievers who aren't there to give this feedback back to their kids, right? Here now, I could give that feedback, and now this tool could give him that feedback, and he could move forward and manage his time. But there's whole swaths of children, especially if we tell them that this is cheating, right? There's whole groups that won't get near this that I've heard from. So that, you could see the gap and start widening. So your name?
Joel.
Joel, yeah, any thoughts, Joel?
Yeah, I think the tool, like the all on itself, is fascinating. I actually found more power, I think, out of the embeddings and vector.
Yeah, that's cool stuff.
Than I did the all on itself. Because I found, like, based on and this pair are probably straight into the right architecture benefits, was that if I could really hone in my search and really like tune my content with that search, I could end hallucinations almost entirely.
Yeah. So for the non-techies, I'll try to translate. Yeah. So who's used Azure AI Search? Okay, MVPs and the BizStream people. Okay. So when you ask a question, you use a different model, and it turns your question into a vector. And I think Azure AI Search is 1,024 dimensions. So it turns your question into this vector, a mathematical representation on over 1,000 dimensions. Like, that's already mind-boggling in itself. But what people are doing now is in RAG, they take, let's say, all the documents in BizStream, and they load it into a vector database, and they use a text embedding model, and they say, text embedding model, go into every single document and make a vector, a representation. So you've got thousands of documents that are represented by these vectors in this like multi-dimensional space. And then you ask a question, and this vector database says, this question using cosine and angle similarity is this vector and this vector and this vector, documents 5, 6, and 54 are the closest to answering your question. And it brings in that and references it. And that's what Bing does right now in the Copilot search. is it uses a vector database to answer your questions, and it's grounded in truth, which is really, really fascinating.
Unless your content creators don't check their content.
Yeah, if you put bad stuff in, it's a bit,
That's the human element.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right. So there's movement into making this hallucinate less and give you grounded content, which I think is fascinating too. And it's newer, so you don't hear a lot about vector databases, and RAG is still relatively new too. But I want to share with this group, like this stuff, it kind of moves almost daily, hourly, almost. Like this presentation is probably obsolete now. So, oh shoot, I'm gonna have to step up here. All right, so just real quick on this history. I went to Thailand for my sister's wedding. I'm half Thai. I'm from the very north region called Loei. What's interesting about that region is my aunt was the mayor of this town called Nong Khai, and I asked ChatGPT about it. And since they're way up north and they're not digitized, right, you can imagine it knew nothing of my aunt and the history of that northern region. So this is a little bit about the biasing and what the data that was used to train it. Part of my history is not in these models, which is sad, but also, as we talk about, maybe good. Who knows? I went to Thailand. It was a really interesting experience. I speak both languages fluently. My mom decided the next day, once I landed, that I would be the translator on stage. So we had a side that was Thai and we had a side that was English speaking. People would speak in one language and I would go up and translate into other language. Some words didn't exist. Some phrases shouldn't be told, especially these kinds of stories, right, in the other language. I was also jet lagged, and it was just really, really difficult because I was processing, trying to remember phrases and things, and trying to find words, but there weren't words all the time, and then speaking them. And a lot of this was love and feelings and emotions, and like, how do you translate them into other language, right? But the point is, I spent 45 years trying to perfect my accent, how I translate, or between these two languages. And then I started using AI, and I could see how it was translating into Thai. And then I started using other languages like Indonesian, Bahasa. And I was like, wow, this does it instantly and perfectly, right? Across all human languages. And then I think by accident, Microsoft's like, oh, this even speaks computer languages. It talks to inanimate objects that have sensors added to them, right? So I was like, this took me 45 years to discover and perfect. And this model could do it all, all the languages. So kind of mind-boggling to think about, but kind of why I love it is because of my history. We're going to go into a magic wand question. This is my favorite question because with the Microsoft, yeah, go ahead.
Before we go there,
Yeah.
talk about where you're from, if there's not any information about it. With the current systems, I'm assuming the new updates are pulling real time off the internet, or are they still trained and set to the side? Because my thought is, part of the way to train at that point is for individuals who do know to start creating blogs and things like that specific to the lack of knowledge so that it can be pulled in during your search. I don't know how effective that would be.
I think large language models it's too intensive and expensive to pull and constantly train. So there's fine tuning, which is if you have a language, and I'll talk a little bit about fine tuning too, is if you have a language, you can fine tune and train the model to speak that language. It's very expensive, but it's also one of the reasons they went to RAG, is it's much cheaper. It doesn't know all the documents in a single instance because it's not pulled into the model, but it references. So RAG is retrieval augmented generation, so it's retrieving the knowledge. So I recommend looking into RAG, but that's one of the reasons you don't see current data being pulled in, and why Bing chooses RAG is because it's very, very expensive to train a new model. And I'm not sure we want that, like a model that knows everything. So I'm going to go into the magic wand. I went into, it was really interesting, the Human Development Index, the UN keeps track of this, and they track countries that go in and, education, kind of like BizStream does. healthcare. They try to develop their country and the individuals, and they push education. So and then it was a little worrisome to see the U.S. This far down, but it was interesting to see Switzerland up there. But I believe with AI, with what I've seen it able to do, I think you can now do some really, really big things for humanity, for culture, for society. And so I'm going to ask maybe 2 or 3 people. So I have an MVP award, which is interesting because I get to see stuff that not the public doesn't necessarily get to see yet. So I get to see it before it's released to the public. And it's kind of a lonely place at times because there are times when you're like, I can't tell anybody for a period of 6 months or whatever before they release it. But I also did a Founder Hub startup program through Microsoft, and they handed you $150,000 worth of Azure credits. So you can imagine now I have access to Azure, GPT-4, GPT-4o. I had $150,000, which I'll never spend. I can't spend it by myself, on the tokens. But if you had access to this, my question to you is, if you had a magic wand and you had access to this knowledge and this power and it was free, what would you do with it, right? And I want you to think big a little bit. So any brave souls want to attack a problem? If you had a magic wand, what would you solve? Nobody. Wow. Usually I get a few, but.
Logistics of food waste.
Yeah.
Food disbursement. Would that be a good problem?
That one has come up almost every time I've spoken and asked this question, right? Food insecurity, food distribution. You see in restaurants, food getting thrown out, and you know that people are starving in certain areas of the world. So efficiency in that whole process. And I had Walter's Gardens here in Zealand. They were at a presentation and they brought that up. They're like, we wish there could be efficiencies throughout our food distribution. Nobody should go hungry during these times. So that's a good one. Yeah, anybody else?
Something, dealing with politics now, we talk about gerrymandering and things like that. Being able to use it in order to create proper districts that are, yes, determined by whatever particular political party is in power at the time, so that it best represents, because that's what we're supposedly trying to do, right? Best representation for an area, and we don't seem to do it very well. Something like that could take care of that, which is a big deal, because that way we'll have people represented who just aren't now. So.
Yeah, politics. I won't go too far down that, but interesting in these times, right? Because in a way, if you ground it in truth, this is access to all the knowledge in the world, and you can ask it. If you know how to prompt it right, you can ask it from different viewpoints, right? You can empathize with people. You can understand what sways you, why certain people vote. You can use it the wrong way, you can imagine, or you could use it the right way to do good in society. And I think politics is one of those areas where this could augment and help. So one more maybe. Clean energy. Oh yeah, I was just reading the oil. Then we have the oil sands, and then I was reading about the drought. Clean energy and water, because they're pulling from the aquifers, and it may run out too, right? So renewable resources, renewable of energy, of oil and water, I think are super critical, super important. So yeah, in terms of sustainability, I'll talk a little bit about EV. In this presentation too. So nice, big ones. Like I used to ask this a year ago and people were like, oh, my marketing content. I wish you could just do that. I was like, no, bigger, think bigger. And we already talked about this a little bit, but this came out about a year ago. Pew Research did this. US adults, it was who had used ChatGPT broken down by different groups. You could see men use it more, women use it less. White, Black, Hispanic, Asian. So I'm half Asian. You can see where I sit on that chart. Age, you see the younger generations use it. Post-grad uses it more. Upper income uses more. So when I saw this, I was a little concerned. But I'm curious, what do you see? What are your thoughts when you see this?
I see inequity in the knowledge that's being distributed.
Yeah. Yep.
The different groups based on education and income.
Yeah, and this, I saw, you know, and I've gone into high schools. How many of you use it? You know, it's usually the guys the boys that are brave enough to raise their hand and say, yeah, I use it. And I went home and asked my wife. I was like, why? Why is this? And she's like, well, you know, it could be I'm, you know, girls, women, more rule followers maybe. So in this world where schools administration are saying this is gray, you know, will our daughters, will our wives be less willing to use this source of knowledge? And will the risk takers, the men, use it more? And does this cause a gap? So that's an interesting point. Like, I don't know the answers, but this came up. So anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Makes me think that the problems that they're tailored to solve are for people of upper income or higher education.
Interesting. Yeah, so problems to solve. And then, you know, there's that people have been saying this is like a white collar, you know, job replacement. So, so it's interesting that you say that because that's also the group that may fear it the most. So, but it is a knowledge base, right? A kind of a endless knowledge. So, yeah, one more thought, maybe. Anybody else when you see this?
People age, they have less exposure or
Oh,
experience with it. That's interesting because technology is being used against the elderly in scams and such, but also those maybe making in positions of power, more senior in their career, we have less experience with these tools than.
that's fascinating catch. Singapore, they, I think it was 2 years ago, implemented, you know, brought in ChatGPT, said we're going to use it K through 12 plus academia, right? They said everybody start using it. Cheating, yes, but we want our country, because they're resource constrained. So they said we want our country to be the #1 top, right? And they implemented it throughout their schools. And I was like, wow, how bold is that? But they also, it was 2 months ago now, they got up in Parliament and said, you know what? We're going to give this to our elderly. And we're going to train them to use it. Because imagine, this gentleman, parliamentarian, got up there and said, imagine what our country can do if we teach people with all this life experience how to use this tool and then bring that knowledge back into our society. We couple the generational knowledge with this tool to gather knowledge and then share it with our society, right? I was like, I want to move there. That would be a neat place to watch this all go down. This is, I wanted to bring this. We are in Michigan. The U.S. Census Business Outlook Index, you know, they finally did that AI supplement. But you can see this question: during the next 6 months, do you think businesses will be using artificial intelligence in producing goods or services? And only 5.5% of the businesses they surveyed in Michigan said yes, right? And we're number, I think I counted, we're number 30. We're not even in the top half. So, you know, that worries me a little bit. You got countries, you know, states, sorry, DC, Colorado, Nevada, Delaware, Utah, California. You know, some of the bigger economies, bigger states are using it, and we have a large manufacturing automotive base, but we're a little bit behind here. I wanted to show, this was data I was pulling from that US Census set today. In the last 2 weeks, did this business use artificial intelligence in producing goods? 70% said no. In the last 6 months, what types of applications of artificial intelligence did this business use? So this is a brand new chart. Marketing automation, virtual agents or chatbots, natural language processing, top 3. How about this room? What are where are you using AI? So Mark, I know you're using some, right? Yeah.
We use it internally. We're building bots on the bank system that look at processing policies. And you just ask, PTO, what about this? Or how do you handle grieving? Whatever. It will just explain a policy. Or, like, how is our team doing on our goals this week? Take that query and input some functional tool and queries and then JSON answers questions about where we're at. So kind of build that into Slack see some of our clients. Mostly, again, the easiest sell is the AI search.
Mhm.
That's the easier, recruiter search, pretty easy to kind of explain that. Again, with the Levis, I think there's this education barrier. They don't
Yeah.
know what it can do, could do. That's why they're not thinking they're going to use it. But search, that's easy. Chat bots that help them out, that's easy. Maybe beyond that, like training customer models or stuff,
It's too much, too big of a jump. Interesting. You're kind of like Singapore. I feel bad for all the other companies. Like anybody else want to chime in? As you were talking, I was like, wow. Like there's companies that, like surging ahead. You've adopted it. You're surging ahead. There's going to be companies that are falling behind. So any other thoughts on this? Yeah.
We'll just talk about usage. Me as an instructor, I teach Python, I teach Linux, things like that. And other than the student using it, I'll use it to help grade a
Yeah.
lot. Or I hate reading papers. I throw it in there. How's the spelling? How's the grammar?
Yeah.
Did you write this or not? Those type of questions, I'll use it. In Python, I'm helping create better lessons for the students,
Yeah.
figuring things out. And what I'm setting up right now is auto grading for a lot of the simpler material, and that can help me write those auto grading components that can be a little more difficult and things like that. So big uses. On the side, I'll use it for letters of recommendation, things I don't like writing normally.
Yeah.
They're wonderful for that. And again, it's not magic. I don't say write a letter of recommendation for X. I usually spend an hour.
Yeah.
You do the whole thing. Pull stuff in. It's a tool. It's not a crutch. I don't let it do everything.
Yeah.
But it makes my job a million times easier. So,
Yeah. I'll just chime in on a couple of uses that I use it for. For a period of about a month, I chatted with it. At the end of the day, I would ask it to be a neurologist, psychologist, sociologist, and I was like, review our whole chat today on what is interesting and from each of these perspectives. And I said, now create a system prompt that I'll use tomorrow. And you're going to be these, brain scientists that I know nothing about, but you're going to help me, be more efficient, prioritize, meet my values, my goals. And then I also chatted with it and was like, what do you think my goals are? And I would chat with it and reflect. I was like, that's not really what I want to be. I want to be this kind of person, right? So I refined this, and I did this over a period of a month, and I have it's like a digital twin. And I throw it in and I simulate my interactions with the world. And that's what I was doing before I came here. I said, I'm going to BizStream. I'm working with Azure, potentially Azure developers. You know me now. How should I present this so it's interesting to this audience, right? Anybody else before I go and jump into another story? Any other interesting uses? Yep.
For developers, I like to use it for like mundane tasks, things I know how to do, but I know that they can be faster.
Yeah.
Like a SQL query, like I know how to do it, but it's been a while since I've joined, so let me throw that in there and kind of get done for me. So,
Yeah. I used Power BI, right? And writing some of the DAX measures is convoluting, and I did it the other day, and it just like that. Yeah, go ahead.
My brother uses it extensively for Dungeons and Dragons session planning and it does some magnificent work for that. So
Yeah, my boys, their YouTube, great YouTube content, and they use it for scripting a lot of times to make it engaging for their audience and get people to comment. My wife was applying for a job. She was kind of, if I don't know if it's all women, but she told me that she was, had confidence. If the job didn't align perfectly, and, we got a recruiter in the room, the job didn't align perfectly, she wouldn't even apply for it. She didn't have the confidence. She's like, I can't learn new things. I need it to align 100%. So she got this thing from a company called Penguin Random House, which anybody heard of? Big, largest book publisher in the world. And so she's like, how should I prepare? What are they looking for? So I said, all right, ChatGPT, here's her LinkedIn profile. Here's the job description. Here's her resume. Here's Penguin Random House. Simulate for me the interview with the HR manager, the first person, and then the hiring manager, and really tell me what their mission is and what they're looking for and how my wife would, and it scripted it for her, right? It scripted it for her. And she went back, I think 2 weeks later, looked at the posting. There were 2,000 people that applied for that job. She beat them all. It's 100% remote. She works out of Holland for Penguin Random House in New York City, right? So using it to simulate and pull all this context together, right? Absolutely incredible what it can do for people. So I'm going to talk about, I went on a trade mission. So I was like, hey, I'm Microsoft AI MVP. Automation Alley out in Detroit was going to Thailand and Vietnam. I was like, will you send me? And they're like, what's your product? I said, it's AI integration. They're like, usually it's parts, auto parts suppliers. You know, we've never had an AI person, but we'll take a chance on you. And I landed in country, and Microsoft, I think Sweden had heard. They told Microsoft Singapore, Microsoft Thailand said, we're going into EGAT to speak, and we need you to come with us. And I was like, what's EGAT? And I had to call my mom, and she said, that's the US or the Thai, it's the government entity that runs the electric production in the whole country. They run everything. It's, you know, we have our own private. They have one entity by the government that runs it all. So I went in there, I presented, talked about my neural voice projects. I didn't know what to expect. I jet lagged again. But then I saw Microsoft go there, right? And I watched them do something incredible, which was, you know, kind of along the lines of predictive maintenance. And this was a year and a half ago. But they said, so just some context. Thailand, you know, the trade war with China, but there's with the U.S. So there's China's expanding in Southeast Asia, and they're doing a lot of EVs, and they're sending it into Southeast Asia, and there's this influx of EVs coming into Thailand, right? And you can imagine EGAT's going, how do we build the charging grid, the electrical infrastructure for all of a sudden we have all these cars. So Microsoft went in, they're like, all right, we're going to simulate for you. Let's say you're in the northern regions of Thailand. There's not a lot of infrastructure out there, but we put in the charging station, simulate what the sensors on this would spit out if it was failing, right? Because it's going to be hard to get parts out there. So it spit out all this data, like, you know, 5 columns, hundreds and hundreds of rows. And they took it and put it in another window, and they said, now go look at this data that's coming from this charging station in this region of Thailand and tell me which components are starting to fail, and tell us which parts we need to order. And it went through, and this was a different instance of GPT, and it started solving the problems for them, right? They simulated the problem, and then they started solving it and could prepare the country for this. So you can imagine, you know, Thailand, EGAT was like, wow, this is incredible. We're simulating inanimate objects that give off sensor data and, you know, using it for predictive analytics to prepare our country for the influx of all these EVs, right? So that was the highlight of my trip to Thailand. And the other highlight is, does anybody know this gentleman? He's Bing Goy. This was before he was, he went on this trip with me, and he was like, I'll go with you as your business development manager. And he came back, and he's now Grand Rapids commissioner of the 3rd Ward. So, so pretty cool. So this I wanted to talk about because now we start talking about the rules and regulations kind of in schools. If we don't have rules, if we don't tell students it's okay or not okay, and we leave it this gray zone, you know, what happens? A lot of these large language models pulled in a lot of data. And in Germany, for example, they actually have the right to be forgotten. So they can go to OpenAI and they can say, I want me and everything you know about me pulled out of there, right? And this started me thinking too, is I'm working with West Michigan Water Safety Alliance, and we're mining data about drownings on Lake Michigan. So the question there, you know, some people, when they see the list of those who have drowned in Lake Michigan, they're like, those names should never be published. But some of their families released the names so they could save somebody in the future, right? So that goes into the right to be remembered in this data set. Because is it wrong for me to pull the name but leave the statistics on that person? But if the family, you know, they wanted that name to be known, that story to be shared. And then Germany is on the other side. And they said, you know, if somebody wants to be forgotten, if they want to start a new identity for whatever reason, they have the right to in Germany, right? So this stuff moves so fast, and there's questions like this coming up every day, for us to think about. So, and just to bring it more locally, there's a couple websites that keep track of legislation by states on AI. If you look here, they track maybe 15 states that have AI legislation. Michigan was not listed here. This was a Stanford report. I think it was Stanford. I'll have to look up. I need to put the source in there, but you can see Michigan is not at the top two either, right? So also concerning, you saw my initial slide where Michigan is further behind in terms of AI implementation, and also in terms of regulation, we're a little bit behind on that. This, if you're an investor and you're looking at states to invest in, and you're looking at maturity, and if the government is subsidizing or starting to are they making it stable? If you're an AI company, if you look at this, right, it would worry you a little bit if you're coming into Michigan. And this is an interesting one. This was in that Stanford report too. This is public opinion of AI by different countries. You can see here, US, light colors, right? We have a pretty low opinion of AI as a country. What's interesting is Southeast Asia, Indonesia, right here, you can see really, really dark colors. Malaysia, Mexico is pretty dark. Where was Thailand? Thailand over here is pretty dark. This was interesting because it was about a month and a half ago, Satya Nadella traveled to Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. He said, announced data centers in all three of those countries with high public opinions of AI. He also put 2.2 billion into Malaysia, 1.7 into Indonesia. Malaysia is not the biggest GDP by country in Southeast Asia, but I believe their infrastructure is the best set up for AI, right, in terms of internet reach. Thailand has a weakness there, so you didn't see the money going to Thailand. Oh, and we're going to go back to academia real quick. So academia, this is interesting. U of M did this. My son's going there now. And they released this, if you go to their website, General Artificial Intelligence website, in their IT department, they released this, I think 2 years ago now. This right here is, if you look at it, it's Azure, it's ChatGPT, because you can add Llama, or you can add all the models that are listed in Azure AI. That's here. So if you're a student on any campus and any position at University of Michigan, you can start using GPT-4 for free. What's interesting is UM-Maisie, they kind of hid, but that's RAG. So they set that up for their researchers, and you just take all your documents, they have a little upload thing, and then they can start talking with their documents, right? You can imagine now, you're a researcher, you're going for your PhD, you got to go through the library, read a bunch of documents. You can load all the documents you have and start asking it to look for gaps in human knowledge and where you should direct your research, right? So pretty interesting in terms of academia and what U of M has done in terms of providing this for their students. Because you think now, you have classes, right, for computer science for high school students. 4 years down the road, if you're going to hire from a college, which college are you going to go to, right? You can go to U of M and have a student that's well-versed in prompt engineering, GPT-4, they use RAG every day. So pretty interesting. Any thoughts on that before I move on? I'm probably out of time, aren't I, Brian? Okay, all right. I'll start wrapping up. So James, any thoughts from you? The academic? No.
I know we're talking about offering either all the instructors or instructors and students some access to ChatGPT-4 or something similar.
Yeah.
So but we're really early in that right now. We haven't even asked for the thought of budgeting. Right now they're paying for a little. We all picked a whole bunch of stuff out to different tools that we thought were interesting, and they're letting us demo and play with them, things like that. I'll be giving a talk in August to one of our training sessions about my use as both as an instructor and as a technical lab manager there on how I utilize it, hopefully giving them ideas. But hopefully they'll give us some feedback from the upper echelon.
Yeah.
And get excited about it. So.
Yeah, And just speaking of that, like you're talking about evaluating different tools and upper echelons in different departments. What I thought was fascinating about U of M is, they're enormous. Like, how did they move so quickly? Like, and they put it under the IT department, and they had it right away. I mean, it was months after they released, Azure OpenAI and had it on Azure, right? To get that whole campus, all their campuses aligned and moving forward that quickly, incredible. All right, I'm going to start wrapping up, but the magic wand question: what would you do? Like what I do, what I discovered is that I stumbled upon custom neural voice, and it was a girl in Puerto Rico. She was born with a lot of congenital diseases. She had spinal paralysis. She couldn't move her hands, high up in the air. She couldn't speak. And so I started working with her mother and her caretakers, and we took an Azure Percept at the time. It used Edge artificial intelligence, and I could train it. Have you used Custom Vision, Microsoft? Yeah. You could train it to, you could customize sign language for her. So instead of sunshine being up here, I had it moved here. So she could just do this. And then, at first it was displaying it on a screen. And her mother's like, well, she can't carry a screen around. She's in a wheelchair, Charlie. So I said, okay. So I went back to Microsoft, and they're like, oh, we have this custom neural voice. We can record her voice, and she could sign her way, and then this device will speak back in her voice. I said, but Microsoft, she doesn't have a voice. But then that led me to the question of, so what happens if you don't have a voice and you could choose a voice? Whose voice would you choose, right? So kind of an interesting question. Which we've never kind of asked before. So I emailed her mother, and I still remember the moment she wrote back. It's like, I asked, her name was Isis. I said, Isis, I have this technology. We can clone your voice, and we can give your voice to your daughter so that when she signs her way, she can speak to the world, and you can share your voice with her, right? So you can imagine giving, of the voices she could have, it's a loved one, her mother, the one that's taken care of her all her life, right? So we did send a prototype. That's Maria right there. And you can see the Percept working, and it was detecting the sign that she was signing. I think it was Mama at the time. And then beyond that, this is a gentleman his name's Chris Martin. He was a radio DJ, had 2 bouts of throat cancer. He lives here in Holland, Michigan. They removed his vocal cords. Because he was a radio DJ, he had some videos of his old voice. So we extracted the voice from those old videos, and he got his real voice back. And I used, with permission, I don't know, Stephen, you were at the TEDx talk. You actually met Chris, and you heard his neural voice. And then I presented and used his neural voice on the screen. And Microsoft refers those people to me now. And just last week, and the process used to take months, but now it takes a couple days. But a gentleman in Washington was a lecturer, director of communications, and he used to lecture about massage therapy, I believe. And he lost his tongue completely. They removed the tongue, throat cancer, couldn't speak, but he had his audio. So it was maybe 5 days ago, we trained his new voice, and he was using his new voice, and he's using that. So you can see how powerful this is, right? Because what I've heard from them, there's a lot of tears when they first get this voice back, because it was unimaginable before that they would get it back. They were told, your voice is gone, it will never come back. And then for Chris, for Maria, it was a new voice, her mother's voice, or for Robert, they get their original voice back. Oh, and I was an art prize too. So just real quick, this was Azure Percept Edge artificial intelligence trained to detect ballet. So the audience would come do ballet steps. I would detect the emotion that they were trying to convey through their body language. And then I put it through the cloud server on a Power BI report. And this was 3 or 4 years ago. It was a little bit ahead of its time, as you can imagine. But this was probably the only art piece at that art prize where, most of the time you go look at the art. This art was looking at you and interpreting you, right? Thinking about you. You were the art piece in this art. And I'll just end with this. So I drove out to Pine Ridge Reservation. Has anybody heard about Pine Ridge? Wounded Knee, do you know about that? Okay. Wounded Knee happened at Pine Ridge. And it's one of the poorest counties in the US. Average income 30K. It's a desolate area. They don't have a lot of clean water. So Rotary International and Rotary in Holland sent $15,000 to connect clean water to a lot of the trailer homes out on the reservation. But when I got there, what's interesting is they speak Lakota. And Lakota is their native language, and there's only 2,000 speakers left of Lakota, right? And I started talking to them about AI and how you can fine tune it to learn a new language. So if we had enough samples, we could train the model to speak Lakota. However, a lot of the words in Lakota, it was set up a long time ago, they're sacred. Only certain people can speak them at certain times, right? So if you train a mathematical model to learn that language, is it allowed to speak? And if so, who makes that decision, to train this model, right? So these are the kind of ethical questions that I have to deal with. As I'm working with a university in Sierra Leone right now. They have a bunch of tribal languages. Do we add them, or do we respect the right to be forgotten, or do they have a right to be remembered and put into these AI models, right? So that's the conclusion of my presentation. So